I grew up in a modest two-story house in a small town with my parents and my older sister Grace, who was only 2 years older than me, but sometimes it felt like we lived in different worlds. My father owned a small cafe that brought in enough money to keep us comfortable, while mom stayed at home and occasionally helped out at the restaurant. They refused to help me go to college, but years later they expected me to pay $150,000 for my sister's dream wedding. Grace, that presentation was amazing. I remember mom saying, "You're going to go so far in life. You're just so talented." One evening after a school function, I stood in the doorway with my certificate from the science fair, but no one seemed to notice. It was always like that, with Grace being the star and me being the shadow. That was the pattern of my childhood. Every family gathering became a showcase of Grace's accomplishments, even though I inherited her old one with the cracked screen and she wore designer clothes. Did you hear about Grace's SAT scores? Her dad would likely tell our relatives that she scored in the top percentile, and she is also the president of the debate club. I learned to blend in during these conversations, knowing that my straight A's and my role as treasurer of the environmental club wouldn't be worthy. I mentioned that, although I was doing well, I might as well have failed in our home. Stella's mother once told me, while I was assisting her with folding laundry, that I should consider realistic career options, such as working in retail or customer service. The word hurt, but I had grown accustomed to the constant reminders of my perceived limitations. What I hadn't gotten used to was how they seemed. I now understand that those early years were laying the groundwork for everything that would come after. The incessant comparisons, the subtle put-downs, and the obvious message that I was somehow inferior to my sister left scars that would take years to heal. But occasionally, the deepest wounds become the strongest motivators. My family was unaware of how their treatment would ultimately shape all our lives. The whole house erupted in celebration when Grace received her college acceptance letter, and my mother prepared her favorite dinner. Dad brought home a pricey bottle of wine, and they spent the entire evening planning for her future. Our bright girl is attending one of the best universities in the city, and my mother couldn't stop smiling. "We've been saving for this day since you were born, sweetie." I sat quietly at the dinner table, pushing food around The response couldn't have been more different when it was my turn. I had worked hard to maintain good grades, joined clubs, and even took extra courses to boost my college applications. But none of that seemed to matter. College mom's laugh was scathing and dismissive when I brought up the topic, "Stella. Remember, we simply can't afford to send you to college. Additionally, you're not college material, but what about all the money you saved for Grace?" I asked in a trembling voice, and my dad uncomfortably cleared his throat. That was different. Grace had a clear path, excellent grades, and you're more suited for practical work, which I could use another cafe waitress. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and I begged that you just help me get started. "So we could borrow from mom," said icily. "We don't borrow money, and we're not going to change our principles for you. You need to accept your limitations and find a suitable job." I cried in my room that night, but by morning, my tears had been replaced by determination, and I went to my grandparents, Grandpa, who were the only people who had ever really seen me. "I'll pay back every penny with interest or take out a loan, and I'll even get it in writing with a lawyer." Grandpa's eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and anger, "But let me see what I can do so that no grandchild of mine will have their dreams crushed like this." The next few weeks were an emotional roller coaster, starting with the disappointment of the bank rejecting the loan application. Then, "Grandma, I need your help." I explained everything through tears at their kitchen table. "I can't just give up on college, Grandpa." I applied to study investment management in a city far from home, as far away from the constant reminders of my family's lack of faith in me as possible. The day I left, Mom and Dad didn't even come to say goodbye. Only my grandparents stood at the bus station, Grandma hugging me. The shocking moment when Grandpa announced he was selling their old country house and the plot of land it sat on, the sale of the property provided exactly enough for my college tuition. I stayed with my grandparents in their now smaller home, while Grandpa wiped away what he tried to pretend weren't tears. From that day on, I severed all ties with my parents. When breaks came and I had to return to town, their sacrifice meant the world to me, and every time I entered their humble home, I was reminded of what true family support looked like. After 4 years of arduous work, I eventually earned my degree in investment management. I had high hopes and a recently printed diploma when I returned home, but reality set in. The job market wasn't exactly welcoming to recent graduates, so I spent weeks applying without receiving any encouraging answers before I finally found a job at a small trading company. It wasn't the prestigious investment firm I had hoped to work for, but it was a start. I found a small apartment on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, for using my own money, and then I got the call I never expected. Stella Grace's sweet voice said, "It's been ages. You should come over for dinner this weekend. I'd love to catch up." Her tone should have warned me, but I agreed that perhaps time had changed and we could finally have a genuine adult relationship. I couldn't have been more mistaken, though, because when I got to Grace's house that evening, I knew right away that I had fallen into my parents' trap. They were already there, as was Grace's boyfriend, a dapper-looking man in a fancy suit who hardly acknowledged my presence. The interrogation started as soon as we sat down to eat. So Stella's mom started her fork poised in midair. "Tell us about this job of yours," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's small," but Grace interrupted with a laugh. "Trading company," she said, referring to those bargain stores. "But really, you didn't need a college degree for that. I told you that college wasn't necessary for you, dear mom. Such a waste of your grandfather's property." Dad laughed and swirled his wine glass, but my offer still stands. I could use an educated waitress at the cafe. Grace's mom, who is a manager at the Citibank, beamed. Thomas, who works as a lawyer with Anderson and Pierce, Grace's boyfriend, nodded smugly. People with college degrees would ask, "Would you like fries with that?" And everyone laughed except me. I stared at my plate and pushed the food around like I used to do when I was younger. "Where did you say you're living now?" Grace asked, though I hadn't mentioned it yet. "I found a place on Cedar Street," I said quietly. The table erupted in theatrical gasps. "Oh, Stella, that's the worst." I stood up so suddenly that my chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You know what? I'd rather be a beggar than be like any of you," I spat. She paused for effect, saying, "You know people who can't afford better live there." "Beggars, she means." "Beggars, Mom," Stage whispered, and they all laughed again. For years, the distance hadn't changed anything. They were still the same cruel, judgmental people they'd always been. Despite their protests and accusations, I grabbed my purse and made my way out the door, promising myself that this would be the last time I ever saw them. Life has a funny way of surprising you just when you think you've reached a dead end. I was still working at the small trading company, doing my best, but at least I got where I am on my own without riding on someone else's coattails or living off of Daddy's money. Feeling stuck, my heart began to race when my phone rang one afternoon. And it was Lisa, my old college roommate, Stella. You won't believe this, but she was practically shouting with excitement. "You may recall how we used to talk about working for Maxwell Investment Group, which was opening an office in your city and was looking for new talent. I had already put in a good word for you, management." That evening I updated my resume, and the following week I prepared for the interview. I felt as though everything in my life had been building up to this point. The interview wasn't easy. They questioned me about everything from specific investment strategies to market trends, but all the extra work I'd done at my current job and the extra research I'd done in my spare time paid off a week later, and I received the call I was in from day one. I threw myself into the work while others left at 5, and I stayed late creating new investment strategies and improving my project proposals. My first big project was managing a portfolio for a mid-sized tech company, and when it produced a 40% return in the first quarter, people began to notice Stella. My supervisor said, "This is exceptional work," and he gave me a larger bonus during my 6-month review. I worked harder, took on bigger projects, and developed a reputation for turning financially troubled investments into gold mines. The bonuses kept growing, and I had a plan for every penny. 2 years after I started at Maxwell, I walked into a luxury car dealership. The salesman probably thought I was lost until I pointed to their top-of-the-line model and said, "I'll take that one," in an hour. Grandpa's mouth dropped when I gave him the keys to my shiny new car when I pulled up to my grandparents' house later. However, I wasn't finished because the following month, I closed on a gorgeous apartment in the Heights, the most prestigious new development in the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, and a view that gave you the impression that you owned the entire city. I was leaving my building one morning with coffee in hand when I took a slow sip of my coffee, enjoying the moment, and then I heard a familiar voice. "Oh, I live here." I pointed casually to the penthouse level of the building that we had just purchased, and the look on Grace's face was priceless, a mix of shock and disbelief. But more than that, a week later, I saw envy in my perfect sister's eyes for the first time in our lives. My phone rang and I saw my parents' number on the screen. It was shocking enough that they hadn't called me in years, but even more shocking was that they were in the neighborhood and wanted to visit. I agreed more out of curiosity than anything else. When they entered my apartment, their faces were priceless. Mom's eyes darted from the panoramic windows to the designer furniture, and Dad stood clumsily in the entryway as though he were afraid. I simply offered them seats on my Italian leather sofa, and they exchanged glances before Mom cleared her throat. "Well, we have some news. Grace and Thomas got engaged last month, and they announced it at an engagement party that I wasn't invited to, of course. This is pretty amazing how well Mom managed to run her finger along my marble kitchen counter. You must be doing very well for yourself." "I am. We've offered to pay half the expenses as is traditional." Dad shifted uncomfortably. "But it seems the total budget is, well, it's $300,000, and I almost choked on my water. Mom continued to talk in that familiar wheedling tone I remembered from childhood, explaining that Thomas's family has certain expectations because they're very prominent in the community. We said we'd cover half before Dad interrupted, saying, "We're asking for a loan and we'll pay you back, of course. We'll even get it notarized." We know it's a lot, but we can't back out now because it would be so embarrassing. You need $150,000, she said, looking at me thoughtfully. I finished for her exactly, she said. You're doing so well living in this gorgeous apartment and working at such a prestigious firm. Thomas's family has certain expectations. For example, when I wanted to go to college, I interrupted you to ask for help. When I offered to sign a legal document promising to pay you back, Mom's face flushed. My mom said, "You don't borrow money on principle, Stella. Be reasonable." I stood up as though you were reasonable when you told me I wasn't. Mom objected, saying that it's unfair that you're only here because you need something from me. You didn't invite me to the engagement party. You haven't spoken to me in years, and now you want $150,000. I walked to the door and opened it. I don't loan money on principle. College material. You offered me a waitress job instead of helping me. Get an education. You let Grandpa sell his property to help me while you saved all your money for Grace. They stormed out, Mom muttering about gratitude and Dad avoiding eye contact as I closed the door behind them. Mom's face turned red with anger, and I thought, how dare you throw our words back at us after everything we've done for you and everything you've done for me. I laughed bitterly, and I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders for the first time in my life. I had stood up to them on my terms. In my own home from a position of strength, my phone rang again the following day, and it was Grace. "What's wrong with you?" She didn't even bother to say, "Hello, Mom," telling me what had happened and how selfish you could be. I sat back in my office chair and watched the sunset through my panoramic windows thinking, that's rich coming from you, Grace. Everybody knows you're doing well and you have the money. Why won't you help with my wedding? I could almost laugh at the selfishness. Absurdity, family. And now all of a sudden, I'm family. What about when I was at your house and you all called me a beggar? When you made fun of my place of residence? When you laughed at my job and then that was different? Grace objected, saying that we were just making jokes. But what's even more absurd is that none of you talked to me for years until you needed money. And if you're in such dire need, why don't you ask our parents? They're your real family after all. The line died as she hung up, and I sat there for a moment, surprised to find that her words didn't hurt anymore but just made me tired. A week later, I was having Sunday dinner at my grandparents' house, a tradition I'd had for years. It's obvious enough that over the years, your bitter, ungrateful Grace exploded. You think you're so much better than us now with your fancy apartment and your big job, and you're still the same pathetic little sister who was never good enough. Grandma had been unusually quiet while serving the pot roast, and your parents had called us yesterday. Grandpa's voice was heavy, so I put down my fork. I assumed they were asking for money for the wedding, and Grandma nodded. They seemed desperate. I believe your mother had a lot to say about family responsibilities when we told them we were retired and didn't have that much money. Grandpa went on to say that your mother dared to suggest we sell. Grandpa said with a satisfied tone that we don't sell gifts from family members who truly care about us. Unlike some people, Grandma reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and the three of us sat in understanding silence. She said something like, "Well, you sold the land for Stella's college, didn't you?" and suggested that we sell the car that I gave you. I was shocked by her suggestion. Word spreads quickly in a small town, and my parents made sure it did so even faster. Within weeks, their version of events had spread throughout our entire extended family and social circle, and I began to hear snippets of their meticulously constructed narrative from a variety of sources. Did you hear about my mother's friend loudly gossiping about her younger daughter at the local grocery store without realizing I was in the next? When I visited with my grandparents, Aunt Martha called one evening, full of criticism, saying, "Your mother told me you wouldn't even let her into your apartment when she came to visit. How could you treat your mother that way? She now claims she's too good for her own family and won't even speak to them anymore, saying they're too poor for her." At church, relatives would also give me glares. I had learned long ago that defending yourself against toxic people only gives them more ammunition. So instead of telling everyone how my parents had only ever helped when they needed money, how they had never supported my dreams, and how they had constantly made fun of and denigrated me, I chose to concentrate on my work, spend time with my grandparents, and let the rumors fly around me like fall leaves in the wind. My grandparents knew the truth, lived through every moment of it with me, and that was enough. But with 2 weeks to go before the wedding, Grace made one last try. "Stella, we need to talk," she said, sweeping past me into the living room. "This has gone on long enough. We're sisters. We shouldn't be fighting like this." I stood by the window, arms crossed, watching her settle herself on my sofa. "To help. You better understand the situation." She gave me her best pageant winner smile and said, as if she owned it, "Why are you here, Grace? To make peace." Thomas's parents are not just wealthy. They have connections everywhere, so I waited knowing there was more to come. The final payments are due next week, and she twisted her engagement ring nervously if Mom and Dad. "This visit isn't really about reconciling. It's about the money." Well, yes, but she got up and walked over to me, placing her hand on my arm. "Stella, please, you're my sister. I need your help. We need to make a good impression on Thomas's parents, so I gently removed her. Can't contribute. Their share. It's going to be so embarrassing. Thomas's parents will find out they can't afford it. It won't just reflect badly on mom and dad, it will reflect on me and my future with Thomas, she said, her voice shaking with anger. I don't care about impressing Thomas's parents, I don't care about your perfect wedding, and I don't care what any of you think anymore. You're making a huge mistake. I smiled, feeling truly at peace, and realized that for the first time in my life, I was certain that I wouldn't. A few days after Grace's visit, my phone lit up with a text from Sarah, her college friend, who had consistently shown me kindness, felt that I should be aware of what had transpired at the country club the night before. She wrote that your parents finally had to tell Thomas's family that they could no longer avoid the wedding planner's calls. It was reportedly quite a scene, and I could vividly imagine the exquisite country club dining room, Thomas's affluent parents, and their designer clothing the moment my parents had to confess they couldn't afford their portion of the Sarah Thomas claims that her mother had practically gone purple with rage over the wedding costs. But the meticulously planned fairy tale wedding started to fall apart. The honeymoon suite and the Maldives were canceled, the vintage champagne order was reduced, the designer flower arrangements were made simpler, and Thomas's parents finally agreed to pay for everything themselves. But the damage had already been done. The wedding did proceed, albeit it was scaled down from its original plans. A week later, the wedding pictures surfaced on social media, and I found myself scrolling through them with a glass of wine in hand one evening, examining the faces in each picture. I was not invited, but I didn't expect to be my grandparents' guest. They received an invitation, but I declined, sending a polite note about prior commitments. Instead, we spent that Saturday together having a picnic in their backyard, steadfastly avoiding any mention of the event happening across town. Grace was wearing a designer dress, Thomas was dressed up and formal, and they were positioned around him like pricey statues. My parents were easily identifiable in their new clothes, which they had likely purchased on credit, and they were making a concerted effort to appear as though they belonged in this world of old money and country club memberships. But their smiles and poses were forced, and their looks ranged from barely in one particularly telling shot. His mother was seen staring at my parents with the expression typically reserved for something disagreeable found on the bottom of one shoe. Sarah occasionally texted me updates in the weeks that followed, and Grace and Thomas moved into a house his parents had purchased for them as a wedding present. My parents didn't visit much, so it seems they weren't quite what I haven't spoken to my parents or Grace since before the wedding, and I doubt I ever will. But I'm sitting here in my apartment watching the sunset paint the city sky in tones, just like Thomas's family had planned for Sunday dinners. Of gold, I'm at last content that certain bridges had previously burnt ought to remain ashes for